so many of us here, I've been watching and listening to my colleagues speak on the floor about the Judge Kavanaugh nomination for several days. And like so many of my colleagues, I want to commend Senator Collins of Maine for her thorough, detailed, and eloquent remarks yesterday. Sometimes a member gives a speech that we know will always be remembered because of its thoroughness, its seriousness, its thoughtfulness, statesmanlike quality. I think we all are in agreement that that happened yesterday with Senator Collins. I also want to highlight my very good friend, Senator Murkowski's remarks last night. While we voted differently yesterday and will most likely do so again in a few hours, she made some important points, particularly regarding some of the issues surrounding this confirmation process as it relates to our great state of Alaska. I very much appreciate her friendship, and like so many, I know this process has been difficult for her, as she talked about that last night. In fact, Mr. President, for millions of Americans, and no doubt thousands of Alaskans, the process to confirm Judge Brett Kavanaugh to the U.S. Supreme Court has been a searing one. Searing. Certainly for Judge Kavanaugh and his family, for Dr. Christine Blasey Ford and her family, for this family, the U.S. Senate family. It's been a difficult period. It has also evoked very traumatic memories of experiences that far too many women in Alaska and America have had. Far too many. And I'm hopeful that in the aftermath of all this, we can go through a much-needed period of healing. Now, Mr. President, as you know, the advise and consent responsibility of the Senate is a solemn one of the most important responsibilities we have here. The process I went through in order to cast my vote for Judge Kavanaugh today has been extensive and thorough, and I believe fair, which is what I believe my constituents back home in Alaska demand of me. After the President announced Judge Kavanaugh's nomination, I read hundreds of pages of decisions that he authored. I listened to the views of Alaskans and have continued to do so up until yesterday. Those who are in favor, those who oppose. And in my first meeting several weeks ago with Judge Kavanaugh, we discussed at length and in great depth his viewpoint on a variety of national and Alaska-focused legal issues. Now, that wasn't the first time I had met Judge Kavanaugh. In fact, I had known him back when we served together in the Bush administration. I knew him as an honest and dedicated public servant, and I actually followed his career as a judge on the D.C. Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals. The lengthy meeting in my office convinced me that he is someone who will interpret the law and Constitution as written. He understands the importance of separation of powers and federalism, holds a healthy skepticism regarding the expansive power of federal agency, and that he is a strong protector of the Second Amendment. All issues that are very important to my constituents that they care deeply about, which is why I focused on these issues in my discussions with Judge Kavanaugh in my office several weeks ago. I was convinced then, and remain so, that he is well qualified to be a justice on the United States Supreme Court. But, Mr. President, as we all know, after a number of these meetings, several weeks in my case after meeting with Judge Kavanaugh, two issues arose that I took very seriously. The first was a claim that if confirmed, Judge Kavanaugh would not fully recognize or respect the rights of Alaska Native people and the U.S. government's trust responsibilities to them, very important constituents of mine. The Alaska Federation of Natives, a very important group back home in Alaska that represents the Native people of my great state, wrote a memo speculating how Judge Kavanaugh, if confirmed, would threaten unique laws and programs for the Alaska Native people. The second issue that arose, of course, that we have been debating here, and the country is fully aware of, was the allegation that Judge Kavanaugh sexually assaulted Dr. Ford in 1982 when she was 15 and he was 17. Like many senators here, I put my heart and soul into investigating such claims, particularly given how important both of these issues were to my constituents, and I want to address each of these in turn. Mr. President, the Alaska Federation of Natives, AFN as we call it back home, memo was focused on concerns stemming from an amicus brief written by Judge Kavanaugh 18 years ago when he was a private attorney in a case dealing with Indigenous Hawaiians before the U.S. Supreme Court called Rice v. Cayetano, in which the U.S. Supreme Court, in a 7-2 opinion, essentially agreed with Judge Kavanaugh's position. Now, Alaska Natives make up roughly 20% of my state. They are incredible Americans, patriotic, hardworking, a beautiful culture, and their legal and sovereign rights, which are based on the U.S. Constitution and federal statutes, have been extremely hard fought, including in this body, over decades. And such rights are fundamental to the health and well-being of Alaska Natives in my state. After the AFN legal memo and similar letters and op-eds were published back home in Alaska, I sent them to the White House for Judge Kavanaugh's review. I then spoke directly to him about these issues. He reiterated to me in a thoughtful and thorough discussion that the legal rights of Alaska Natives, to include tribes and regional and village corporations, were very clear and well established in the law, which is actually different from the situation of Indigenous Hawaiians. Therefore, the views expressed by the Supreme Court in the Cayetano opinion that limit the rights of Native Hawaiians do not extend to Alaska Natives and are not applicable legally in any way in Alaska. This is because Congress has repeatedly and explicitly recognized rights and the tribal status for Alaska Natives, including the federal government's trust responsibility, while unfortunately, in my view, Congress has not done the same for Native Hawaiians. Senator Murkowski was on the floor last night. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but I think the Alaska delegation has always tried to be supportive of the Hawaiian delegation in this regard, and we continue to be. But legally, they're very different, and in a response to a question for the record to Judge Kavanaugh released by the Senate Judiciary Committee, Judge Kavanaugh unequivocally endorsed this point. He stated, now this is his language, the Supreme Court has recognized that Congress has the ability to fulfill its treaty obligations with Native Alaskan regional and village corporations and American Indian tribes through legislation specifically addressed to their concerns. Unlike Indigenous people of Hawaii, Congress has explicitly recognized in statute that Indian tribe includes any recognized Indian or Alaska Native tribe, band, pueblo, village, or community. Native Alaskans are Indian tribes and therefore enjoy all the relevant rights and benefits that come with their trust relationship with the United States, unquote. In my conversations with Judge Kavanaugh about Alaska Native legal issues, he also reiterated a point emphasized by Chief Justice Roberts in the recent Supreme Court case called the Sturgeon case, that because of federal statutes like the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act and the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, Congress has repeatedly made clear that Alaska is different in many ways from the lower 48, and he recognized and told me, as part of this confirmation process, that many legal issues involving my state need to be viewed through that lens. To be perfectly clear, Mr. President, if I believed or saw evidence that Judge Kavanaugh's views were somehow opposed to or hostile to Alaska Natives, a very important population of my state that happens to include my wife and my 3 daughters and my mother-in-law, I would not support his confirmation. I told Judge Kavanaugh this directly, but that I was also satisfied with his response after we had this discussion, a deep, detailed discussion about these issues. Importantly, Senator Murkowski came to the same conclusion in her discussions with Judge Kavanaugh, and she said as much in her remarks last night. Of course, there's another allegation, a claim that I want to talk about this morning or this afternoon, the allegation that has been the focus of much attention here in the Senate regarding sexual assault that I likewise took extremely seriously. I respect very much Dr. Ford's bravery and sincerity in coming forward to testify in front of the Judiciary Committee. I am convinced that she went through a traumatic experience that has left deep wounds. I also applaud the bravery of the many women who have called and written and visited my office to share their experiences in this regard. So much of this has been very painful for so many to revisit these episodes. As I repeatedly stated, all allegations of this kind of conduct should be seriously looked at. So I undertook the due diligence that my constituents expect of me and is required of the Senate's important advise and consent role. I watched the Senate Judiciary hearing on this issue, gavel to gavel. I read every piece of information available, including all the interviews conducted under the penalty of perjury by the Senate Judiciary Committee investigators. I read text messages, threads, witness statements, letters between the committee and lawyers who have been involved, and confidential committee documents. I supported and read the professional and thorough supplemental FBI report recently submitted to the Senate, which looked deeper into this allegation and spoke to additional witnesses in relation to it. And most importantly, Mr. President, I met with and heard from hundreds of Alaskans who have suffered from sexual abuse and domestic violence. Many flew thousands of miles, most on a moment's notice, to come to my office and to meet with me and Senator Murkowski. I applaud their bravery and their passion. So much of this process has been painful for them. Alaska is an amazing state. I come down to the floor all the time to talk about its majesty and beauty and our wonderful people, and I believe that in my soul. But one area where we are not so great or wonderful or majestic is this. My state has the highest rates of sexual assault and domestic violence in the country by far, in almost every category. It's a horrible, horrible thing, and it impacts so many families in the last frontier, horribly. Throughout my public career in Alaska, I've worked to combat sexual assault and domestic violence by putting more offenders in jail, bringing more resources to survivors, including much-needed legal services, and raising awareness of this heinous problem by working to change the culture of violence that's too pervasive in my state. We have a lot more work to do on this issue in Alaska and across America, including on our college campuses, and I applaud Senator Gillibrand for her leadership in this area and many other senators as well. The allegations by Dr. Ford have been difficult and wrenching here in the Senate to address. But one thing is clear to me, her allegations have been taken seriously as they should have been. Mr. President, I have a summary from the Judiciary Committee on its investigation into these and other allegations that I would like to submit for the record.
Without objection.
It shows a staff of over 20 members of the Judiciary Committee literally working around the clock for weeks on all leads, any lead that came in on these serious allegations. These investigators who have the authority of the law If people speak to them and they lie, they commit perjury. They spoke to more than 35 individuals pursuing any and all substantive leads. This is in addition to the FBI report. And I want to commend Chairman Grassley for his serious and diligent work in this regard in the work of the committee. Wasn't highlighted a lot, but it's very serious work. Some of it, a lot of it's detailed here. Two important points stand out from this work, Mr. President. First, the committee has not obtained or received any evidence that would corroborate the claims made by Dr. Ford. And they've talked to and tried to pursue leads in so many different areas. Dr. Ford's allegations were investigated respectfully and thoroughly by this Senate Judiciary staff and the FBI. And as I mentioned, she certainly had courage in coming forward. Nevertheless, these allegations were not corroborated. The four people Dr. Ford claims were present had no knowledge or memory of any such event, and the others the FBI asked about the alleged incident had no knowledge either. One of them, a lifelong friend of Dr. Ford's, Leyland Kaiser, said she didn't even know Judge Kavanaugh. Again, Mr. President, as you know, all of these statements were made under the penalty of perjury. Another important point from the Judiciary Committee summary, again, I would suggest people take a look at it, given the seriousness of the allegations and the seriousness of the investigation, that has not been picked up on is that the minority staff of the committee, those representing my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, refused to participate in most of these investigations, sometimes not attending any interviews at all. And when they did, they refused to ask questions. Now, Mr. President, this is truly a mystery to me. One of the constant refrains in arguments, and I'm saying it's been in good faith from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, which continues today, is the need for more investigations into the allegations against Judge Kavanaugh. They've been making that argument very regularly, and yet when you read what happened in the committee, they have refused to take part in almost any part of the intensive ongoing investigations from the Judiciary Committee staff investigators, of which there are 20, and they've been working on this diligently. Now, I'm not a member of the Judiciary Committee, Mr. President, but it's my understanding that this is a very significant break from past bipartisan investigations that have almost always occurred on the Judiciary Committee for every other previous Supreme Court nominee. So I'm not sure why this happened. Perhaps one of my colleagues can explain it, but it does make one wonder. So, Mr. President, where does this leave us? As Alaska's former Attorney General, and now as a U.S. Senator, I strongly believe in ensuring perpetrators of sexual assault pay a very serious penalty. I oversaw prosecutors who put such criminals away for decades and even indicted an alleged rapist according to his DNA sequencing in order to toll the statute of limitations for such a crime when we couldn't physically locate the alleged perpetrator. But I also believe that the presumption of innocence is sacrosanct and a fundamental American principle, whether in a criminal trial, in a Senate committee hearing, or the court of public opinion. I'm convinced that due process should apply as much to the Senate's advise and consent responsibility as it should in a court of law. If we lose this basic concept of fairness, then we risk doing irreparable damage to the very foundation of our democracy and core conceptions of American justice and even liberty. We do not want a system of guilty until proven innocent in America. Such a principle can lead to incentivizing false accusations that do lasting damage, especially when coupled with breathless media reports that repeat verbatim such charges. Unfortunately, we have seen this phenomenon during this confirmation process. Now, I am not referring to the allegations of Dr. Ford, which were taken seriously, but in the aftermath of her allegations, some horrendous and what appear to be patently false claims were made against Judge Kavanaugh. Such false allegations do tremendous damage to the accused and his or her family, but just as bad, Mr. President, they also risk undermining the credibility of true victims and true survivors of sexual assault. This is something that's been overlooked, I believe, in these discussions. One of the most disheartening aspects of this confirmation process has been how some of my Senate colleagues and members of the media were so quick to publicly embrace some of the most outrageous and incredible claims made against Judge Kavanaugh. That, for example, he participated in the drugging and raping of women as a teenage boy. A senior member of the Judiciary Committee referenced this sickening, uncorroborated allegation in her opening statement at one of the hearings. The immediate damage to the accused and to his family by such a charge, which reverberated across the nation, was obvious, but less obvious, but perhaps more damaging to so many in the long run, is how such false claims undermine the ability of true victims and real survivors with real claims of sexual assault to get justice to be believed. I certainly hope that this is not one of the outcomes of this dysfunctional confirmation hearing process, but it underscores how and why the entire system of American justice and fairness can be undermined if we abandon the presumption of innocence. Finally, Mr. President, I again want to thank and applaud so many of the women in particular, including so many Alaskans who flew to D.C., who have spoken out about this nomination and have shared stories about their very difficult experiences with assault. I know from being in meetings with them and hearing from them and listening and reading that this process has brought fresh and painful and difficult memories for so many. I want them to know that from the bottom of my heart, I'm committed more than ever to work on combating these horrible crimes and domestic violence and trying to change the culture in our nation to one of respect. And indeed, Mr. President, if there is a silver lining to come out of this contentious confirmation process, it is that the awareness and commitment to do more to combat these horrible crimes has been heightened. I've heard this from many of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle in the past few days, including Senators Murkowski and Senators Collins, Senators Harris and Klobuchar, and I'm certainly committed to working with all of them to make this happen. At the same time, I do not agree with some of the comments made on the floor that a vote in favor of Judge Kavanaugh is somehow condoning sexual assault or somehow not believing all survivors. As Senator Collins stated yesterday, nothing could be further from the truth. A bipartisan majority of U.S. senators, men and women, are likely to vote for Judge Kavanaugh in a few hours. To mark all of them as somehow not caring about the broader issue of sexual assault in America is not only untrue and an affront to them, but undermines the larger cause of working together to combat this issue. Mr. President, I do not believe that this is a binary choice. This is not and should not be a Republican versus Democratic issue. This is actually an American epidemic, and frankly, it should be viewed more as an American male issue. The men are the ones who are committing the vast majority of the abuse, and we need to work together in this body and across the country to be united to stop it. Mr. President, I will be voting to confirm Judge Kavanaugh as the next Associate Justice on the Supreme Court. But on this broader topic that I've been discussing this afternoon, our country has a lot of healing and a lot of work to do. And I'm certainly ready to do my part in that regard with all of my Senate colleagues, Republican and Democrat. I yield the floor.